I wonder what this could be. Oh my goodness. No, it can't be. SimCity. Oh, I love SimCity. And I've been playing this game in one form or another for the last 30 years. Released in 1989, SimCity is one of the few games from the 1980s that I still play on a regular basis. It's a great little game for a rainy day or a spare hour or two. I just sit down with my coffee, forget about the world for a while, and build a world of my own. SimCity, the original or classic release, is still quite enjoyable, perhaps a bit because of the nostalgia that I have for it, but I also think perhaps because it is, in my mind, still the simplest and most parsimonious of city building games, not having to worry about density or managing water or sewer pipes or having to mess around with complex terrain tools. You just plop down some residential, commercial, industrial zones at a power plant and voila, your city begins to take shape. It's a bit of science, a bit of art, but all your own. And SimCity was my very first sandbox game. And while each successor added features and made changes, some better, admittedly, perhaps some worse, this is where it all started for me, and I don't see myself giving it up anytime soon. Now, SimCity 2000, oh man, there was never a sequel I was more excited for. In fact, and this took about a year to accomplish, but by early 1994, I had managed to convince my dad we needed to upgrade our old 386 to a newer 486 DX2 system, just so I could run this game, basically, although I, told him that I needed for coursework. But yeah, it was mainly for playing SimCity 2000, as it would be over the next couple years or so. SimCity 2000 just kind of blew my adolescent mind. Most obviously, the game improved significantly on the fairly basic graphics of the original SimCity, giving the player, instead of a top-down view, a pseudo 3D isometric view, as well as the ability to add mountains and other water features. I spent hundreds of hours, no doubt, building city after city, trying to perfect my city, and each one of them was unique. They'd have custom landscapes, and I'd give them these imaginary histories that would work out in my head of how they developed and so forth. And I felt like SimCity 2000 was just real enough that it kind of breathed life into these imaginary stories that I had for these cities. The game added infrastructure, including a whole underground world of water pipes and subway tunnels that we had not seen before. The addition of new transportation options were also very well appreciated, with highways being added for the first time. And as with the original SimCity, you didn't really see the Sims yet. You still basically had to use your imagination. The only indication that there were Sims out and about in your city were the little dots on the roads and highways moving around. But I always imagined that these were people coming back and forth to work and living out their lives in my city. Zoning was upgraded as well in SimCity 2000 with the addition of low or high density residential, commercial, industrial zones, so you could better sculpt the city that you had imagined, give certain places more density, some places less density, and essentially create what I would consider to be rudimentary suburbs and inner city areas, and have those different areas of your city stand out and be differentiated. And of course, SimCity 2000 introduced the idea of arcology, these whole cities essentially within a single, funky looking megastructure. And younger me thought that this was just the most amazing thing ever. I think older me is just kind of glad that there isn't actually one of these things looming over my house. In 1999, Maxis released SimCity 3000, which attempted to expand upon and add to the complexity of SimCity 2000 in almost every conceivable way. The maps were bigger, the buildings were taller, and the terrain was certainly more varied. The SimCity 3000 Unlimited Revision was released not too long after, and this had even more customization with 2 new architectural types, the Asian and European tile sets, and several options for climate and vegetation. Overall, the graphics, I would say, were richer and more detailed than in SimCity 2000. This time with actual Sims and cars populating the streets, making them feel more alive than ever. Some of the games added complexity, though, while adding to the realism of those cities. Didn't necessarily contribute, in my opinion anyway, greatly to the game's overall playability or enjoyment. Things like, dealing with waste management, having to deal with the effects of aging power plants and other infrastructure wasn't always a lot of fun. But I did get used to it, and eventually did appreciate the depth that it added to the simulation. And speaking of which, the addition of a middle density zone, as well as different types of buildings representing different wealth classes, were really quite a welcome addition to the game, and these would be features that would remain with the game's successor, SimCity 4. Released in 2003, SimCity 4 is pretty highly regarded as the pinnacle of the entire SimCity series, and is certainly the most complex of the 5 main releases. I'll admit it took me a while to get into, but certainly after the release of Rush Hour, which came out just later that same year, I was really hooked on SimCity 4 and got into it quite a lot. SimCity 4, I still think, has probably the best looking graphics out of the box of any city builder. I know that's kind of a controversial opinion, but I really enjoyed the addition of the 4 historical architectural styles. I thought that was simply a brilliant idea. The details there are amazing and really do stand in sharp contrast, I think, to the rather generic architecture of the popular city skylines, which came out in 2015. The terrain editing tools in SimCity 4 are also, I think, pretty amazing. They're simple, they're intuitive. They give you what you need to make almost any landscape feature you're interested in, minus waterfalls and some various surface water features. While in SimCity 2000, you could make deals with your neighbors. You could sell and purchase electricity, and send them your trash, your garbage to process, and so forth. In SimCity 4, you are your neighbors, essentially. In SimCity 4, you've got this ability to build enormous regions, essentially without limit, composed of dozens of cities, or perhaps city districts, if you like. This is a huge leap forward from the previous games, and meant that you could go on building a single large city or metropolitan area if you wanted for many years and be quite satisfied. And I did just that. I really don't think there's a single game I put more hours into than SimCity 4. It's simply a brilliant game I can go back to time and time again. The latest in what will likely be the final iteration of SimCity, known as either SimCity 2013 due to its release year, or SimCity 5, is really not a bad game, especially with the expansion and a number of patches to the underlying Glassbox game engine that has occurred over the years. It's quite a playable game, as it turns out. Unfortunately, I couldn't play the game on my vintage XP computer here in the background, as I've done with the others, because of the need for at least an initial online connection through Origin, and of course, Origin no longer works on Windows XP. And that's a bummer, for sure, but at least the game now has an offline mode and doesn't require, as it did at its release, that always online connection. And as many of you probably know, this is one of the reasons the initial release of the game was such a god-awful disaster. I mean, it was really quite terrible because people were constantly trying to get online and they weren't able to, and yeah, it was terrible for the first few months. But getting back to the actual game, like I said, it's not a bad game overall, and is actually, I would argue, quite fun to play. It does help if you approach the game not so much from a city building game in the vein of the previous installments, but rather as a city district or neighborhood simulator. The maps are simply way too small to build an even smaller size city. Honestly, in terms of scale, the game is more akin to a modern version of SimTown. And it wouldn't be all that bad if the maps were simply adjacent to one another either, kind of how they are in SimCity 4. That would at least give the impression that you were constructing one large single city region. Why they decided not to do it that way, I'm not quite sure. It's probably something woven into how the game functions that it couldn't be set up with adjacent tiles. I do like the artistic style of the game, though. It really is a pleasure to look at. And of course, it has that kind of classic Maxis humor that we've come to expect from the SimCity franchise, infused throughout the game, the artwork and the gameplay and so forth. And the modularity of the buildings in particular, I think, was a great idea. I mean, I would love to see that basically in any city building games. And I really appreciate being able to expand, and upgrade my buildings as my city grows and as those needs grow. I really thought I'd miss laying water and sewer pipes, but honestly, the automatic construction of that infrastructure, along with the roads, I thought actually was kind of liberating. It's rather nice not to have to worry about laying all those pipes. So I don't miss that really as much as I thought I would. And the idea of actually building that infrastructure, by the way, along with roads, is not that far off from reality, in the sense that a lot of real infrastructure, sewer and water and all that stuff, actually does get built, as new roads get built. They just build them underground as they're, tearing up that terrain anyway for construction of those roads. I don't play much of SimCity 2013 anymore, though. Again, I think it is mainly because of the limiting size of those maps, and every time I'm really sort of getting into the game, I'm almost immediately disappointed because I run out of space very quickly. So it really takes away from just sort of the game enveloping you in the way that the previous installments did, because you can just spend hours and hours and hours building this perfect city of yours and lose track of time. So it's a rather disappointing end to Maxis, which EA shut down in 2015, and disappointing end to the whole SimCity series as well, I would argue. But it is encouraging, as I've mentioned before, to see that new developers are kind of picking up the torch and doing new things within the city building space, reinterpreting, reimagining, this much loved genre. If you like this video, why not check out some of my others? There's plenty more gaming retro goodness out there and coming out in the near future, so please consider subscribing as well.